show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss the victory of the Taliban. Is this a win or a defeat for the West? Tim?
I'm going to argue this is a total win for the West, at least the West that I identify with, and it's a total loss for the West that I don't identify with. I think the quote made by the Carters, this is from Scott Horton's Twitter following from his oldie but goodie, and this is the Yevgeny Brzezinski. He's speaking to the Mujahideen at the Afghan-Pakistan border. The Mujahideen is sort of a precursor to the current Taliban, and he said, "Your cause is right, and God is on your side." And apparently he's been proved correct with the fall of Kabul in roughly 10 days, if not a few hours. The advance, the blitzkrieg the Taliban did after over the past few months is quite impressive. And I think the sort of picture that the Taliban in the presidential palaces will be one of those pictures that are quite that are historical. There's an old Lenin quote that sometimes in a few days, years can happen. And I think the past few days, years have happened. We saw the United States, one of the primary United States Middle East influences just basically evaporate. And not only evaporate, it's an embarrassing for the sort of neocon and neoliberal establishment. Got to remember, Mr. Nobel Peace Prize winning Barack Obama, he continued every Bush policy. And actually, Donald Rumsfeld, funnily enough, in his Unknown Unknowns documentary, used Obama continuing the policies that he set in place as evidence that they worked or they were the best policies. This is a war that's, and it's also exposed a lot of these phony left-wing anti-war people like Stephen Colbert and Jon Stewart, who made their name on, as well as a lot of left-wing Christians, who made their name on like opposing the Iraq and the Afghanistan war while Bush did it, but then turning around and supporting the other war. So yeah, this is a bipartisan war. It's also a multi-nation war too. Britain was involved. To what extent Britain was involved in following? It's a question I'll ask you a little bit. But this is a huge win for the sort of non-interventionist right. I think it's a huge win for the traditional right. I think it's huge. The sort of what the Rothbard would call the old right. This is a big win for Ron Paul. When Ron Paul talked about 9/11, he asked why it happened. They hate us. No, he said because we were over there. Now again, you could get into whether the United States should have supplied the Mujahideen against the Soviets to begin with. But that question is a much earlier question. This current invasion, especially after the first 90 days, after 9/11, if you want to argue that they should go in and bomb a few buildings, they could have done that and left. And actually some people coming on and saying, yeah, actually the war in Afghanistan worked. We caught the guy. We brought him to justice. That to me is a little stretch. But the sort of nation building exercise of creating an Afghan Jeffersonian republic, turning it into Sweden, never worked and failed miserably. And watching the Taliban take over was one of the most neatest days in my life, in political life. It's one of those historic events. In a way, it's like the fall of Saigon, insofar as, ironically enough, Vietnam is a closeted U.S. ally against China, of course. So, it took the long way around. And I think in going years forward, there's going to be quite support of the Afghan-U.S. relations here. And I think a more realistic, sober analysis would, or instead of we're trying to build, Jeffersonian democracies abroad at gunpoint, we just sort of be more realistic with foreign policy. Of course, I'm an anarchist, a right-wing anarchist of some variety, abolish the state. But in the meantime, I don't really see why Afghanistan is a threat. And as far as 9/11 is concerned, it's another giant rabbit hole that must be brought up. You can accept the official doctrine if you want of everything, but there's a lot of holes in it. There's a lot of classified documents. It's like one of those events like Pearl Harbor. The Americans knew the Japanese code, and yet why are they moving 4 aircraft carriers around? We'll never really know the details of 9/11, but it's just look at the passports of where the people were from. They were from Saudi Arabia and Egypt. They were harbored in there, but it's a bit of a rabbit hole, which we're supposed to just take as given. But that the initial impetus for the war itself has huge question marks, which also brings us back to the old right version. Scott Horton and Alice Hershey. I cannot say her name, but I'll do a thing that makes feminist. I'll call her Neil Ferguson's wife. Was involved in a debate with Scott Horton, and there was 2-on-2. And there was a neocon, more traditional neocon there, and he brought up World War II as name me an successful American intervention. He said World War II, and in a way, as Peter Hitchens said, every intervention since then is an attempt to be a mini Churchill or a mini FDR. And if you read books like Human Smoke and some other books, a lot of that sort of or Peter Hitchens' Phony Victory. I haven't read it yet, but from all I can see, and I can sort of basically get the narrative. The idea is that the West was some good guys and the enemies were, absolute evil. There was a lot of real politics involved there. So I think in that way, when the neocons and neoliberals will bring up the Anglo-American victory there, it's like, well, and we also had to occupy them at great expense with the Marshall Plan, occupy Japan. We also nuked Japan. So even when they bring them up, that to me is also a win for the old right, to the traditional United States, for the libertarian foreign policy as well. So the comparisons that the neocon makes, also in the neoliberals, of course, because they're very much similar. So we have sort of the repudiation of Woodrow Wilson's policy of making the world safe for democracy. And again, reports are coming out. This is from the AP. Built and trained at 2 decades cost of $38 billion, Afghan security forces collapsed so quickly and completely, in some ways without a shot fired, that the ultimate beneficiary of the American investment turned out to be the Taliban. Supposedly, they've gotten hold of F-15 trainers. They've gotten hold of advanced missile systems. And interestingly enough, this is all probably going to Iran. So this is a classic action of an attempt to make something better. You arguably make yourself worse, air quotes. So yeah, those are my overall thoughts on this. I think it's a win. I'm not particularly afraid of Iran. And I don't think the West should be particularly afraid of Iran or the U.S. or Afghanistan. I actually think it's embarrassing in a way being afraid of Afghanistan. Overall thoughts, Swithin, on the historic event there. Swithin, do you have any comments on that? And then later on, I want to sort of get a take on the British take of this.
It's definitely a win. It's the pictures of the Taliban in the political office is hilarious, with the nice table and the picture and behind with the turban guys with the beards and the probably looks like an AK-47. It's brilliant. I mean, would I like to live under the Taliban? No, but what this shows is, as you pointed out, the whole nation-building exercise that the Americans have tried to be engaged with over the last 20 years is just a complete and utter failure. Liberal democracy is not ready. Well, there is not the appropriate soil in Afghanistan for liberal democracy. It's just not a system which will work in that area. And the audacity of the neocons in the West, who think they can just go around the world and just go, well, we know if we look at history that those with liberal democratic institutions are the most advanced societies in the world. So what really needs to happen is we just need to change the institutions. And then, there'll be land of flowing milk and honey in Afghanistan and all these other areas. And it just turned out to be completely and utterly false, which is entirely unsurprising, as most of the critics made it at the time. So the humiliation of the really sort of disorderly withdrawal from Afghanistan. Now, obviously, this isn't good, at least insofar as probably more people died than may otherwise have done with leaving, etc. But the humiliation that this gives to the Americans should hopefully prevent any future interventions. That said, I did think it's amusing that the only reason a lot of people in the West were complaining about, oh no, the Taliban are really bad because of how they're going to treat women and girls. And I'm like, it's almost as if they wanted to change tact on what the justification was for occupation. And it seemed to be the case that, oh no, what we're going to do is trying to liberate the world for women's rights and some sort of a feminist ideology and spread that around the world. I mean, it was just like, I like the fact that you're annoyed because you're annoying the right people. I mean, this is just ridiculous. And again, do I want to live under the Taliban? No. Do I think they are appropriate in all ways? No. But to focus on, oh yes, the reason we should stay there is, or the implication that we should stay and help is because of women's rights. It's kind of like, is that really a justification for invading or maintaining an occupation of a country? If so, please tell me which is the next country you're going to invade, and please say it's Saudi Arabia. Oh no, it's not Saudi Arabia. Oh really? Are you being consistent? No, you're not. There's a surprise. So this is highly amusing. In a way, it reminded me. My disposition is somewhat similar to what happened on Insurrection Day on the 6th of January, which I thought was utterly hilarious. We had these complete buffoons just wandering around the Capitol building. I thought it was utterly hilarious. In a way, the Taliban just turning up as a motley crew is also sort of funny in the same way. So hopefully this will set the American empire back. Although, as Keith Preston points out, quoting, that the American overseas troop numbers are the lowest that they have been for 100 years. So maybe that's just a part of the recession in general. But yes, it is good to see. I mean, if anything, just so that they don't invade any other country and kill more people than should happen because they shouldn't be there. On to the British involvement, we were relatively heavily involved. Over the 20 years, we spent at least £37 billion, which worked out at like £2,000 per household. Now, I suppose you could say, oh yeah, but over 20 years, that's only £100 per household. But it's kind of like, did those people in England really want to pay £100 a year so that we could maintain the heroin supply from Afghanistan? Probably not. The listeners may know, Afghanistan is the world's largest opium producer, and prior to the invasion in 2001, the supply had been somewhat, has been completely choked by the Taliban. So yes, we were particularly involved. Although what's bizarre, I think was it the defense minister or one of the ministers? He started like almost crying the fact that we were leaving Afghanistan. I think he fought there. I was like, what? You really invested that much in it? It's like, well, someone's been like reading the press releases and believing what they're saying, as opposed to kind of like the real reason you're there. Although I suppose maybe this is just acting. I mean, another former British minister has a history, a form with that was good old Matt Hancock, former health secretary, who decided to cry on live television. Although that was probably completely orchestrated, this one may not have been. But Britain was very involved, and £37 billion, which is, I'm trying to think of a comparison. It's about a bit less than annual debt interest payments. Debt interest payments are about fifth largest area of expenditure of the year, just to give sort of a broad comparison. But all I'd say is for the West, this is a big win. If it's a big win if you're in Afghanistan being ruled by Taliban, maybe not. Although I do hear that apparently the Taliban are going around disarming the population. So that probably won't end well. But for the Afghans. But as I say, for the West, there's very little bad with this.
I entirely agree. There is very little bad with it. And in some ways, if the Taliban's goal was to divide, politicize the West, it did a fairly effective way. So getting out of this quagmire is nothing but a win. And as far as the sort of human rights propaganda you see, this is where like, well, he's dropping is bombing a funeral, or is a hospital, or which all things have been done in Iraq and Afghanistan. Let's just focus on Afghanistan, or firing a Hellfire or missile at. Are these really the actions of a humane power, which is what the United States was doing? Now you could argue there are errors, and there's the reports that Searles urinating on Taliban bodies. Again, these really actions. So like a lot of these sort of tears over this is just sort of crocodile tears in a way. They're in the same way with Vietnam. I think the reports are like, we probably with napalm gas, and they're still fixed today, killed maybe 1 million people. Those reports, the number of Afghans who died in this. So like maybe the Taliban aren't the greatest thing, but it's not clear the American-backed counterinsurgency was that nice to live under either. So or that was, and it was fairly corrupt. And the Afghan forces, one of the reasons why they folded so quickly, and this is from an analysis, I forget where it's from, should pull up my link here, was, fairly corrupt. I mean, they spent lots of money to train this sort of domestic army, and it crumbled. And no one cared. And the police chief of Afghanistan, from my understanding, basically surrendered. Everyone surrendered to the Taliban quite quickly. It's quite the romp in a way of forces. So like the people who wanted to stay there, it's like, well, if they so love the Americans and American rule and so hate the Taliban, they more or less welcomed them to open arms. And this also sort of belies any realist strategy. One of the things I think Chiang Kai-shek was correct on, and the South Koreans, the two things that, and actually the British in Hong Kong for now were correct on, is to, you have to sort of retreat to a defensible position. If the U.S. would have focused on, hey, let's just set up the central city as, an American protectorate, and go, say, set that up as a sort of the Jeffersonian East, Jeffersonian Eastville, and say it's Kabul and the surrounding areas, they might have been able to carve themselves out an enclave. They carve themselves out of an enclave in there. But no, they didn't take that sort of realist, pragmatic strategy. The South Koreans, they just sort of, we'll just accept an armistice with the North and draw a line here. Those are the more successful American, and for that matter, British occupations. If they would have taken more reasonable goals, they might have been able to do that. And actually, the Afghanis might have been able to do that as well. But the U.S. sort of bungled the whole thing. And to go back into sort of opaque military history and philosophy, one of the qualifications for a just war is it's a winnable war. This is sort of traditional Christian philosophy here. And was this war winnable? Maybe, Yared Rook was in a debate about, now this again is about Iraq, I think, but it was like the claim was, we didn't fight it well, we didn't fight to win. And that might be true. But like, what does winning look like? How much of the Air Force do we, and how much of the Marines do we have to send over there, and for how long? Indefinitely? And if it's indefinitely, that's a very long occupation. And that requires a lot of restraint from the occupiers not to look like tyrants. And to go back to my older point, just like Vietnam became a closeted American ally, it's probably going to be the same way going forward with Afghanistan. I mean, they're bordered by China. They have Turkey. They have lots of, powers which they probably don't like particularly either. And so, maybe it'll be an interesting picture going forward. Any comments on the humanitarian claims, as well as the occupation, as well as the soul didn't fight appropriately in just war theories with him? And then we'll sort of wrap this up.
Oh, well, certainly. I mean, the big problem with the just war theory, the big reason why it was unjust is there was no clear goal. Well, I mean, some people claim, oh, yes, when they defeated the terrorist camps and stuff, it's like, well, okay, if that's the case, then leave. I mean, if you haven't got a goal, you can't win. And this seems to be a continuing theme of American foreign policy. Unless, of course, the goal was merely just to enrich the arms contractors and increase the military budgets, in which case having an ongoing indefinite war is the best way of doing it. Depends how cynical one wants to be. But I do remember hearing the argument that actually Vietnam was started because Otherwise, they were going to cut the American military budget, so they needed to have another war to happen after Korea. Otherwise, it would have been cut. So it was clearly unjust on that basis. On the humanitarian stuff, it's very difficult to say. I mean, it doesn't seem like a particularly pleasant place to live. As you say, it's almost certainly very corrupt. And of course, the Americans bomb places and being particularly violent. It's not really. It's not obvious how bad Afghanistan would be under the Taliban and under sort of the American-backed sort of quote-unquote democratic government. Another thing that's worth noting here is the Americans could well have attempted to sort Afghanistan out by basically chopping it up into various ethno-states, because most of the disputes and the violence in between the groups in Afghanistan are between various ethnic groups there. In particular, the Pashtun and the Tajik. There's various others as well. I mean, if they'd split the country into various different ones, then, it could have been relatively stable and they could have left. Because one of the reasons why, like, the strongman Taliban is required to kind of keep everybody together is because, well, when you've got peoples who otherwise have massive disagreements with it and would rather not be under the same political community, well, the only way to keep them together is a strongman. Which is, and again, sort of similar to Iraq in that respect. So Iraq should be at least 3 countries. And so it's quite a clear lesson in sort of like the artificiality of various states and how like large level centralization of this kind of stuff simply doesn't work. So yeah, the humanitarian stuff is not obvious. I mean, as you say, you bomb hospitals, you bomb these sort of insurgent groups, and you're having to kill all the people there. I mean, what's worse than that? Girls not going to school or bombing your wedding? I think I know which one I'd choose. So those would be my final thoughts on the whole Afghan situation. Tim, any final comments?
Yes, I was going to conclude here. It's 100% victory for the non-interventionist right, and the non-interventionist left to some extent. You brought up the neocons. One of the things that's interesting that cannot be forgotten is the sort of flip-flop the Democrats did 2008, here in the United States in 2008 2016 on that conflict. And that was sort of the campaign that way. And that's a real victory for the sort of Ron Paul type movement. Because that's one of the sort of central tenets that it's there's a lot to blame to go around there. But I think in terms of victory, one of the people who've been consistently throughout this for like the last 19 years been against this is Ron Paul. Under Trump, he was against this. Under Biden, under Obama, under Bush, under all 4 American emperors, he was against this. So yeah, it's a huge win. I don't think, for the people who are sort of crying about like, the girl stuff, I'd also ironically view that as a win too. I mean, maybe Christopher Hitchens was right when he defended. Again, this is slightly different, but I do think there's a lot of similarities between the two inventions. This is one of Christopher Hitchens' proto arguments for the war in Iraq. You want to set up, liberal democracy. So maybe the left actually does secretly support this intervention, but they can't really explicitly state that because they're supposed to be anti-colonial or anti-imperial. So yeah, overall, huge win for localism, huge win for libertarian foreign policy, huge win for Scott Horton too. So I'm very glad with this, and hopefully we don't go back. Swithin, great talking to you about this.
Oh, indeed. Let's hope we don't go back, and that it's not just an excuse for, we left them for a few years, and look how terrible the Taliban are again. Let's go and liberate them again. That would be the wrong lesson to draw from this. But now I'd just like to thank everyone for listening. If you've enjoyed this show, please share it with your friends and family and subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings and the more people who can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason, please contact us at mindcrimelibертyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibертyshow@gmail.com.